Welcome to Praxis, a podcast where we explore how to practice and embody the way of Jesus in our everyday lives. Thanks so much for taking the time to listen. So we're in a series right now focused on cultivating a healthy church culture. Every church, of course, has a culture, whether they realize it or not. And some churches are reasonably healthy, while others aren't. And of course, no church is perfect. But part of the work every church needs to engage is to intentionally work to close whatever gap exists between being healthy and where they currently are. So in the series, that's what we're doing. We're seeking to close the gap. And this involves not only talking about the marks of an unhealthy church culture, but casting vision for how we as the church can embody a way of life together that, while it may not be perfect, is oriented toward goodness and kindness and love. So after several episodes of naming some of the major toxins in the American church soil, we have now turned the corner and are discussing some of the healthy nutrients we can put into the soil to help create a healthy church culture. And today, we want to discuss the importance of cultivating grace. We're going to talk about what is grace, how did Jesus cultivate it, and how we can embody grace as the way Jesus did. So that's where we're headed. Here we go.
Welcome, everyone. My name's Katie.
And I'm Josiah.
And I'm Mac.
So we are coming up on Memorial Day weekend. And when I think Memorial Day, I think grilling. When I lived in California, they would say barbecuing. By the way, that was so confusing to me when I moved out there. They would say barbecue, and I would think like things with barbecue sauce on it, like ribs. But barbecuing to them just meant anything on a grill.
Yeah.
A grill is a barbecue.
Right.
That's normal to you?
Yeah, I think so. I think you can use those interchangeably, I would say. Hey, we're going to have a barbecue. I wouldn't assume like, hey, we're going to go make ribs. I would think we're going to get the barbecue out and maybe have, burgers or whatever.
So is this like you grew up in Wisconsin, Josiah.
Yes.
So which way do you fall?
If you said, we're going to have I guess it's different. If you're going to say, come over, we're going to have a barbecue, that could just mean you're going to grill meats.
Yeah.
And that'll be the primary food source. But I guess if you said, let's have some barbecue,
that would be different.
I would assume it's barbecued, like it's a Texas
let's
style.
Let's have some barbecue. I feel like is different than just saying we're going to barbecue. There's some nuances.
Well, they don't use the term grilling out there at all.
Sure.
Like that's not a concept.
Okay.
It's only called barbecuing. Anyways, what is your favorite
I
meat?
thought that's what this was.
No, was not the intended discussion. My intended question was, what's your favorite thing to grill / barbecue? But not with barbecue sauce. Well, I guess it could be.
Well, so I have a PK360.
Yeah, Max got it.
I wrote this question knowing that would come up.
We'll add Flame Broiler Plus. It doesn't have that in the title, but it's a pretty awesome grill / smoker.
A barbecue, if you will.
A barbecue, if you will. Yeah. But man, I don't know. It kind of goes. I'll get on something like perfecting this or that, and then that's what we'll eat a lot of. And we just kind of launched the barbecue season, if you will. So I'm still trying to kind of find my footing as to what is the summer theme going to be that I just like absolutely perfect. You know?
I see.
What have previous years' themes been?
I did burnt ends one year. I got really good at burnt ends.
Do you make the whole thing as burnt ends? Like if you get like a flat part of a brisket?
Yeah, at the end though. Last year was kind of a brisket summer. Done a lot of pork shoulder. Did 1 year we got really into like pork tenderloin where I'd make some like carnita tacos as the finished product. That was awesome.
Yum.
So yeah, I've done a few steaks this year, which has been great. We'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see.
I don't know what my favorite thing to make that's in that theme is, but to eat is brisket for sure.
Yeah.
When it's done right.
It's really good.
Pretty hard to beat.
It's easy to mess up too though.
Yeah, it is.
So
I've made it probably 3 times and 3 or 4. And I'm like 1 for 3, I think.
What about you, Katie? Is this a grill or a barbecue smoking
I'd
stuff?
probably go salmon.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
I like salmon on the grill.
Yeah.
Barbecued salmon sounds weird. I don't know how they would talk about that in California. I'm going to
Well-
barbecue some salmon.
Yeah, so I usually use the word smoked. So we'll do salmon quite a bit on
Yeah.
the PK, and I'll say, hey, we're going to smoke some salmon.
Well, but smoking is different than grilling, at least in my mind. Like you need a smoker.
Well, mine does both.
Well, his
So,
does both, which is
Yeah.
why he's bragging about it.
Sure.
That's why it's a nice.
It's
Well, yeah,
great.
but
He
if
can
you
do
just
whatever
have a
he
grill and not a smoker,
Yeah, then that's quite the conundrum. Check out the PK 360.
wants. Maybe we can get a sponsor out of this.
Oh, that'd be funny. Well, speaking of grilling things, right?
Yeah, let's grill. Yeah.
We're grilling up a conversation.
Yes. So as we've stated before, we're in a series focused on cultivating a healthy church culture, and would encourage you to go back and listen to the previous episodes because I think it sets the tone and kind of sets up where we're at right now. Because in this metaphor that we're using with a tree in a soil, the soil is the culture in which our churches exist in, and if the soil is right, the whole church can be healthy. We spend a lot of time identifying the toxins and the things that are sort of plaguing the church culture, not just at large, but like in individual communities. Mm-hmm. And now we're looking at what it looks like to sow nutrients back into the soil to help cultivate a culture that's healthy. So today we're going to discuss the importance of grace. And we want to submit that healthy churches with a Tov culture, they cultivate grace, a grace-filled culture.
Yeah, and the word tov means good in Hebrew for those who might just be listening for the first time. So,
Yes.
Churches with a tov or good culture, they cultivate grace.
yeah, and I think it's important to name that what we're talking about here is culture. And we talk about cultures. Cultures aren't something that are created overnight. They're not something that can be manufactured through like a policy change or just announced from the stage, hey, we're going to be a culture of grace from now on. Like cultures are formed over time by everybody that's a part of the culture. And they take habits and practices. But when something like grace becomes cultural, regularly practiced and embodied, it becomes a powerful force within a community of faith.
Yeah, it's just so important to remember that because you can't announce a culture. You can't declare it and then it happens. It happens by embodying habits and practices over an extended period of time. And Katie, you're the one that taught me this little phrase, tone at the top. Mm-hmm. And so it really has to start with leadership. Mm-hmm. I mean, I suppose it doesn't have to, but it really helps when it starts with leadership. In Church Called Tov, the writers say, pastors shaped by goodness, by Tov, are grace dispensers. They are agents of God called to help, be with, and offer grace to those whom they are called to serve. And so, I think that while pastors aren't exclusively responsible for the culture they create, they have a larger responsibility than most people, which is why it's so important that the tone is at the top. But from a systems perspective, I also want to remind people that everybody shapes the culture based on how they participate in it or don't participate in it. So what that means is while we as a leadership team might have a larger responsibility, we're not the only ones who have a responsibility. It's not just me or even we, like the three of us, that can create a grace-filled culture, right? It's something that everybody has to be involved in creating. And when everyone sort of leans in and embodies grace in their relationships with one another, well, that's when this becomes like a transformative force that begins to take on power and life that is tov, that is good, right? But we all have to lean in and do our part. We all have different levels of responsibility. It's not the same, but we all shape it and participate in it in some way, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and in the metaphor of a tree with fruit, we can't make fruit out of nothing, right? Like it takes an investment into something that over time will end up producing fruit. I think that's important to realize that it's not just that the change is slow, but the entire process is something that you invest and pour into. And at the end of the day, it ends up producing the thing that we're hoping happens. But it doesn't work like a factory.
That's right.
Right. It works like this, like a tree growing fruit. And
Yeah. Culture isn't like creating widgets. You know, you can't manufacture. That's why so many of the metaphors in the scriptures are agricultural.
Yeah.
Like partly because they were living in an agricultural environment, right? In an agricultural society. But those metaphors themselves communicate something different than maybe we would in a post-industrial context where we're accustomed to sort of putting things on a conveyor belt and then it's assembled and here's the outcome, right?
A plus B plus C equals D.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So we're talking about grace here, and we're talking about creating a culture of grace. But to me, this is one of those words that we talk about a lot in the church. Like people say, "Oh, grace and peace to you," or "God's grace." Like we use this term grace a lot. But I was just thinking as we were preparing to sit down, it's going to be really important to define this because I don't know that I would be able to say like, "Here's what grace is." Like when we say it, here's what we're talking about. So what would you guys say to that? How would you fill out how we're defining grace in this conversation?
I think one sort of common way that it's framed is by contrasting it with mercy. So I've heard people say that mercy is not getting what you deserved. So you maybe did something bad and you deserve this sort of consequence or whatever, intrinsic consequence, and mercy is not getting that. Grace, on the other hand, is getting what you don't deserve. So it can include mercy, but kind of goes beyond it. It's in sort of classic verbiage, unmerited favor. In the book, Scot Laura's book, Church Called Tov, they actually quote a theologian, John Barclay, and as their definition. So here it is. Grace is a multifaceted concept best approached through the category of gift. Gift denotes the sphere of voluntary personal relations characterized by goodwill in the giving of the benefit or favor and eliciting some form of reciprocal return that is both voluntary and necessary for the continuation of the relationship. And then in the chapter, they go on and give 7 characteristics of a grace-filled culture. And I don't think it's worth going through all 7 of them, but maybe just hitting a few highlights to kind of answer your question, Katie. They would say that grace involves the giving of gifts. You heard that in the definition. So each of these have their ultimate reference, of course, in God. God gifts us the gift of redemption, right? So grace involves the giving of gifts. At the heart of this gift of redemption is forgiveness. In a grace culture, forgiveness flows freely. In a fear culture, grace is abandoned and forgiveness is forgotten. The work of grace is the creating and strengthening of relational bonds. So it actually grace turns power upside down, whereby we become a family, siblings, right? Where we relate to one another in health, where enemies become friends and strangers become siblings. And all of this they name can't happen apart from the transforming power of the Spirit. So big picture, let me summarize. Grace is a gift. It's not earned. It's unmerited. Grace is voluntary. The gift is offered out of free will. Grace is relational. It creates and strengthens mutual relationships, and it's transformational. It can't happen without the power of the Spirit. Does that help?
It does. I really like the term unmerited favor. I've heard that, and that sticks out to me because in many ways, like we can't know what grace is apart from looking at God. And I think that's what we receive from God. It's like this unmerited favor. Everything from God is grace. The fact that we live and the fact that we woke up today, the fact that we're here doing this, like everything we have is unmerited from God. And when we receive it, that empowers us and equips us to then
like this undeserved favor that we receive. And I mean, for the sake of a simple definition, undeserved favor. And yet we live in a culture, if we're honest, where the myth of meritocracy rules the land. We're like, hey, you get what you deserve. And if you've earned good things, it's because you worked really hard and so on and so forth. And this just cuts against that, right? This cuts against the grain of so much of the way we've been enculturated because it's not based on undeserved favor. The idea is you have to earn it. And this is why I remember one time I was standing in line. This was years ago. at Starbucks. And I just felt like God saying, hey, why don't you buy the person behind you a cup of coffee? I do that every once in a while. And I turned to this lady and said, hey, can I buy you a cup of coffee? Now, to be fair, she was way older than me. So this could not have been, I had a wedding ring out. Like, there's no way. She's like, oh, this guy's hitting on me. And she refused. No, I want to buy my own. And I just thought that was so interesting that, like, sometimes we actually have a hard time just receiving from someone something maybe we didn't deserve or didn't earn. Either because we didn't earn it or feel like we don't deserve it, or because we might feel like we can't repay them back or would need to repay them back. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I'm sure we're going to get into it later in the episode as well. But grace has a way of leveling the playing field because none of us, if we are aware of how much we receive from God, none of us can believe that we deserved something more than someone else. And I think that is what helps create the culture in which, in a way that it's very empowering. It's very empowering for people to know that it's not on me to make sure that I receive something from God. Obviously there's ways we can position ourselves and can be more aware of it. But at the end of the day, pride, if I can remove the pride of what I did to deserve it or earn it, it allows me to stand arm in arm with everybody, no matter what background they have, no matter what they've gone through in their life, what accolades they have. All of us stand very even on the playing field.
Right on. So with that definition in mind, just sort of undeserved favor, one of the through lines in the chapter that I noted was just the idea that grace is the antidote to fear, to a fear-based culture. And I think we're going to continue to see this as we go through these different nutrients. Last time we talked about how nurturing empathy is the antidote to judgmentalism, self-absorption, and narcissism. So cultivating grace is the antidote to fear, where people are ashamed or punished for mistakes and shortcomings. Just a brief quote. Grace-filled goodness begins in forgiveness, forms into freedom, and resists fear, all because it knows that God's design for the church is love. So maybe a story to help flesh this out a little bit. This was years ago. Don't remember how long ago. But I was working, I would say, in a culture that was very fear-based, where everyone was sort of scared to screw up because then they'd sort of get on the lead pastor's bad side. And I remember at one point that happened to me, okay? I'm not sure if I made a mistake, which is definitely possible. It's also totally possible that I didn't make a mistake, but it was just something that this lead pastor didn't like. And anyways, stopped talking to me. And he was giving me kind of the silent retreat treatment for a few weeks, okay? And I remember talking to my dad about this. Like, what do I do? I'm not sure what to do. And of course, he had all sorts of things to say about how a boss should be operating with more maturity and, but he gave me this analogy. I mean, we both played hockey. So he's like, dude, when someone does something wrong in hockey, they get a penalty and they have to sit in the penalty box for 2 minutes. Okay. Usually it's 2 minutes. There's 5 minutes majors, which are rare, or you can get ejected from the game. Most of the time it's a 2-minute penalty. And the point is there's like a defined time period that you have to sit out till you can rejoin the game. And once you've served that, we move on and you get to play again, right? And he was like, so it's pretty unnerving that, like, you don't even know what you did and you're sitting in a penalty box and you don't know how long you're going to be there, you know? So I ended up using that metaphor in a conversation and, we got over it. It kind of forced the issue that, like, I don't even know what I did wrong and when am I going to be out of the penalty box? So we moved on, but I remember in that moment that this, like, captured perfectly for me what it was like to be in a fear-based culture, where mistakes were not treated as opportunities to grow or to increase relationship, but rather as penalties that you had to endure that actually constricted relationship. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, they were held against you.
Right, and that blocks transformation, growth, mutual relationship rather than actually cultivating it.
Yeah. Forgiveness and restoration, like none of those things are even possible.
Right. So I don't know, what would you guys add to this idea that grace functions as an antidote to fear? I mean, think about your kids for a moment, you know? Like when my kids mess up, I've noticed this default where like they want to minimize what happened, hide what happened. They don't want to come tell me about it. And I've got this deal with both of my older boys. I want to hear about it, the full truth, the honest truth, so that you can experience the full grace that's waiting for you here.
Yeah, you were saying how it goes against kind of our society and the culture we live in, and I think that's true, but I also just think it goes against our defaults as humans, like as human beings. This presses against everything like inside of how I make sense of the world, right? Like you do something really well, you're applauded and received well. You do something bad, you feel really bad about it and have to like feel fear and guilt and shame and anxiety or whatever else comes with that. And I think this concept of grace just kind of flips that on its head.
And turns it upside down.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've heard this before, but when you're driving, if you are learning to drive and you are afraid to make a mistake
or
when you're
watching
driving,
someone else drive while you're in the back seat of the Rolls Royce, right?
Oh, yeah. That's right. But yeah, if you're afraid to drive and you're afraid of messing up and afraid of making a mistake, you're going to be a terrible driver. You are going to be nervous. You're going to be starting and stopping really quickly. You're not going to be assertive when you need to merge. Like all these things that come with driving, that does take a level of confidence that I'm going to be okay. I just need to do it. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's how many church cultures exist, is people are so afraid to make mistakes so they either don't try, or when they do try, they're constantly apologizing or having to be overconfident to make up for insecurities. And maybe that's helpful to say like grace. Now, grace is just to say, hey, everything's going to be all right. And we can expect that mistakes are going to happen. And we're going to learn to adjust them. And if you make a really big mistake, we've got airbags and seat belts, right?
Yeah, and insurance.
And an ambulance on hand if something gets really bad.
Yeah, that's a good picture. Like if someone's super anxious about learning how to drive, they're not going to be a good driver. Mm-hmm. Like the fear that's in them is actually going to hinder their ability to grow and operate this huge vehicle with some degree of confidence. And that's what happens in a fear-based culture when people are really anxious about screwing up and there's all sorts of relational toxins and dysfunctional dynamics. People are scared and they're not going to operate at their best. But in a grace-filled culture, you know, where mistakes are normalized, they're going to happen and we learn and grow from them, people are actually going to be able to be much safer on the road, so to speak. By the way, quick side note. Last time I asked the question, what is your dream car? We got into that whole Rolls Royce thing with you, but Katie just got a new car and it's incredible. It's a Ford Mustang.
Mach-E.
An E-car.
Mach-E.
This thing brakes by itself. We were talking about this, Adam. Yeah. And I'm telling you, if I had to go between that car and my van, that maybe would cause some accidents because you never have to touch the brake, ever.
Yeah.
Really?
Right.
As you let off, it breaks. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
It's trippy.
Wild.
I did try it in the parking lot.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, it's fun. I'm not a car person, as I said.
Well, you
but
are now.
I am now,
You
and
are
I've
now.
gotten used to the one pedal gas. The question is when I get back in the van, if I'll remember to press the brake.
I will be driving behind you rather than in front of you in those moments.
So
go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say something that did come to mind when we were preparing is I would assume that some people would say, okay, grace is awesome, but what does it look like to protect people from who are trying to harm or who are making mistakes that need to be restored in a healthy way before being put into leadership again where they could harm again? Because, I mean, that's part of what has began this whole conversation was the idea that, like, there's poor leadership and things running rampant that are producing bad leaders who are harming, like wolves in sheep's clothing. And what does it look like to have grace for mistakes while also
Accountability.
having accountability to make sure that someone if they're intending to harm could not.
Yeah, or even in a relational environment, is grace just supposed to be sort of used to allow for repeated abuse or negative dynamics? Like you just covered all with grace? What would you say to that?
I would say that real grace is getting what you, if we're saying it's getting what you don't deserve, and it's also something that's coming from God, that real grace should also be producing good fruit. And there is a way to have a pseudo type of grace that's not really gracious to both people involved. If someone is if someone is allowed to do whatever they want and just be like, oh, I said sorry, so that means I should continue going. That sounds like grace on one end, but it's not actually gracious to everybody.
That's right.
It may be like showing an individual grace, and sometimes individual grace may be, for now, you should not be in a position of leadership. That's gracious to you, to not be putting you in that place if we can't have some accountability to your health.
Yeah, and I don't think grace and accountability are mutually exclusive. Like you're saying, sometimes extending grace means setting a boundary or having a consequence or putting someone in the penalty box. Like it's how those situations are navigated. They can be navigated in healthy ways or unhealthy ways. And I think sometimes having grace means having integrity. And
yeah, I think it's an important disclaimer that grace doesn't mean we just tolerate negative behavior indefinitely in the name of grace. Doesn't mean we just restore a pastor that failed horrendously in the name of grace. I mean, even Paul had to address this in putting an accent on grace. Should we keep sinning that grace may abound? May it never be. Right. Right? Because a misunderstanding of grace would be like, hey, I can just keep doing whatever I want.
Anything goes, essentially.
Just put it on my tab, because in the end, grace will cover it. And perhaps this is a good transition just to go, how do we see Jesus embodying grace in his life and teachings? Because, in John chapter 1, it says that the law came through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus. And we teach this a lot in our discipleship groups, but that means there was never a time where Jesus wasn't full of both grace and truth. So when he expresses truth, has like high truth moments, let's say with the religious leaders, it's not because he lacks grace. It's because in that moment, that's not what was most needed, what was most loving. At the same time, there's other moments when he calibrates a high degree of grace, but it's not because he lacks truth. It's because grace is what that relational interchange, that exchange needs in that moment, right?
Yeah.
And so maybe to just kind of clarify the question you raised, when all we can do is calibrate grace to the neglect of truth, that isn't love, right?
Yeah.
So let me flip it to you guys. As you consider Jesus, his life and teachings, the Gospels, how do you notice Jesus embodying grace in his life? And I'll just name for me on the front end, just kind of set the stage. Like as someone who maybe naturally isn't as grace-filled, like I tend to sort of naturally orient towards truth. Nothing has helped transform me more than studying the way Jesus calibrated grace with people. So let's fill this out for our listeners. How do you see Jesus doing that in his life and teachings?
Yeah. Well, we alluded to it a little bit earlier, but Jesus extended grace by treating mistakes as opportunities for growth. So think about how many times the disciples failed. I mean, that would be its own study. Just to see all the times that the disciples either said something that Jesus had to be like, no, actually, that's not true.
Get behind me, Satan.
Yeah. Yeah, or like, oh, I want to be on your right hand. And he's like, really? Like, you're missing the whole point. But I think about even the more serious things, like his disciples deserting him when he's at his hour of greatest need, Peter denying him. Jesus did not write them off because of those mistakes and shortcomings. But I think it's probably one of my favorite passages in all of the Gospels is when Jesus restores Peter. I think it's a really beautiful picture of like something he did not have to do. Jesus did not have to do that. I mean, Judas didn't make the cut, obviously for other reasons. But I'm just saying, like, it could have been a lack of restoration, and there wasn't. He still did that, and I see the way that he does that. And
if someone hang on, if someone isn't familiar with that story, do you want to just summarize what?
Yeah. So Peter denied Jesus the night he was betrayed and killed
3 times.
Yes, 3 different times. Jesus dies, he rises again, and when he comes back to see his disciples in this story, they're out fishing, which was what they were doing before Jesus had called them into something different. And so Jesus calls them back onto shore. Peter dives into the water and swims back to shore, and sitting around a fire, Jesus offers Peter the opportunity to essentially say, he asked him, "Do you love me?" And he does it 3 different times as a way of restoring the 3 different times that Peter had denied him. And I think that's, and then obviously we know Peter goes on to be a leader within the early church and has a pretty prominent role.
It's such a beautiful story. And one of the things that stands out to me is just how Peter had already tasted Jesus's grace. I mean, the reaction he has when they catch the massive amount of fish, which mirrors like how he came to faith, and he immediately recognizes as Jesus on the shore. His last interaction with Jesus was seeing the look on Jesus' face when he had just denied him. Mm-hmm. And yet now we see like this incredible amount of excitement, and he just like typical Peter impulsively like strips down and jumps in the water. Why? Because he already knew grace was waiting for him. Mm-hmm. He'd already tasted grace when he had messed up and made mistakes. And then as you narrated, like the fact that Jesus would like solicit an invitation, offer an invitation for him to 3 times confess his love to him, essentially reversing each denial, it's beautiful.
Yeah.
Denial doesn't get the last word. Love does.
Yeah, and I like what you're saying about this. Peter knew what was waiting for him with Jesus. He had already experienced enough of that when Jesus was on shore and he was ashamed of what he had done, he didn't turn and run away. There was this sense of like, I've been waiting for this opportunity to have that. And maybe that's a cool picture for us to paint, that in a culture that emphasizes grace and growth and treats mistakes as opportunities to be restored and for that growth, we could start to see that's some of the fruit that gets produced. Like rather than running away when we make a mistake, we can run towards the people that we have had experiences with where like, hey, I messed up again, or I did this. I need, can we clean it up together?
Mm-hmm.
It's so much better.
Yes.
It is so much better. Jesus met people where they are rather than where they should be, which allowed him to pivot out of grace. And I had a win just recently. There was someone who wrote me an email kind of critiquing some of our preaching and this and that. And it was an honest and genuine email. There was no like malicious intent behind it, but there was a few things in the email that just hurt. And I've been trying to practice rather than just absorbing, unfair critiques and things of that, to be honest with people. So I wrote this person an email back, just kind of like affirming the things I could, but then being honest, like some of these comments hurt me and here's why. Mm-hmm. And the next request was, hey, can we get together to talk? And so we met up, and I didn't know I wasn't sure what was going to happen. And this person just sat across from me and apologized and asked for forgiveness. And it was just such that rarely happens. So kudos to this individual for embodying our values as a church. But it was just so beautiful because it didn't have to it immediately became a point of celebration.
Yeah.
Like, of course we're going to hurt each other. Like that's what, like if we're going to be in community with each other, misunderstandings and hurts are going to happen. Of course I forgive you. We don't have to make a big deal out of it. Thank you for acknowledging it. And let's move forward. And the rest of the conversation was just a totally different tone than before, because we knew what grace was and it had been asked for and extended and it went both ways, and on we went.
Yeah.
I loved it.
And those reps over time are what we're talking about creating. It's like you're sowing those with every interaction you have. You're sowing those nutrients into the soil, and hopefully over the long stretch of time, this starts to become the normative, that as people make mistakes, they don't assume that they're going to be thrown out. They will assume that if I go to the person that I made a mistake to, that I hurt, and I ask for forgiveness, I can expect that it's going to be a good conversation.
Yeah.
I mean, that'd be true in so many things. Even think about all of your personal relationships. If you knew, I mean, within marriages or friendships or anything, if you knew that if I go to this person and I fessed up, I know that I'm going to receive grace. How much power that has to create health.
Yeah, to create relational connection.
Yeah.
Yeah, if we all did everything perfectly all the time and we like achieved everything we deserved, like there would be no opportunity for grace. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I love that. Jesus, so I hear you saying he extends grace by how he relates to people and their mistakes and their failures.
Yeah.
Another way I would say Jesus extends grace is by befriending the wrong people. I put quotes around the word wrong. You're talking about Jesus and his disciples, Josiah. If you look at who he called or invited to be his disciples, they weren't the people you would have expected.
Yeah.
They weren't the people that were necessarily at the top of the rung with the religious elite, especially when we look at Matthew. Matthew was a tax collector, which meant he would have really been seen as almost like a traitor of his Jewish heritage to be collecting taxes, basically exploiting his fellow Jewish people in order to collect taxes for the Romans who were oppressing them.
And pad his own pockets because they often overcharge people to get wealthy.
Totally. Yeah. So he would have been despised by the Jews at the time. And Jesus invites him to be his disciple, which would have really brought a lot of questions and, dare I say, scorn on Jesus himself by inviting Matthew to be a disciple. He would have been one of the last people we would have seen. Like, okay, this would be, in my mind, it's like, this is like asking the CEO of McDonald's to run a weight loss clinic. Like, not the person you would expect to. Is that a good analogy? Inappropriate? But okay, my point is, Jesus extends grace by inviting Matthew to be his disciples. It goes back to unmerited favor. Matthew didn't deserve it. None of them deserved it. But Jesus chooses to tarnish his own reputation by extending grace. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, that's not just like an isolated incident or moment in the Gospels. Jesus seems to do this quite frequently. In other words, it wasn't just a one-off. This is a way of life. Like, here he is in John chapter 4, and there's a woman at the well in the middle of the day because everybody, and you don't go to the well in the middle of the day. I mean, it is a hot environment. You're going to go early in the morning, and she's by herself. So clearly excluded from the community. And in that culture, men and women who weren't married didn't sit and talk like that. But what does Jesus do? He meets her where she is and extends her grace. And actually, she becomes the primary spokesperson to declare who he is. Mm-hmm. And you just see this over, again, just read through the Gospels and notice all the times Jesus associates with the quote-unquote wrong person, and it ends up being an opportunity to express or extend grace, and it's transformative and then leads to a kingdom breakthrough moment. Mm-hmm. Over and over and over again.
Yeah, he certainly wasn't concerned with social capital, as we would say it. And that, to me, helps capture the essence of grace.
Yeah. And maybe to add to this one, Jesus extended grace by swapping condemnation for forgiveness. So we just talked about how he hung out with the wrong people, right? But in many of these moments, instead of condemning a person, which is what everybody else around them was doing, he offers forgiveness and restoration instead. So again, woman at the well, you have a community that looks down on this woman with condemnation and judgment. She feels that and is excluded from the community, is now at the well by herself. Jesus meets her with grace, restores her, and then she becomes a bridge back to that community, right? You think about the woman caught in adultery, which we've talked about before. And quite frankly, it's really more a story of men caught in their hypocrisy, because they sort of set this trap for Jesus. And where's the man, who is quote unquote caught in the act with this woman? He's nowhere to be found. But in any case, you have a group of people who have stones in their hands ready to put her to death. Condemnation, judgment, verdict. And what does Jesus do? He bends down and writes something in the sand. And we don't know what it is. I tend to think it's a verse from Jeremiah. But whatever it was, it basically functions as a mirror for them to reckon with their own sin. And then one by one, they drop their stones, right? So what is he doing? He's extending grace to that woman instead of orienting her with punishment, condemnation, or judgment. He actually says, is no one here to condemn you? Then neither do I. Go and sin no more. Right? So you see that he's if we're going to embody grace the way Jesus does, it's going to have to involve swapping out condemnation, penalties for forgiveness and restoration.
Yeah.
That makes sense?
Yeah. Yeah, you have to care about something more. You have to care about something greater than just the matter at hand.
Yeah, and so in a church staff, where things are toxic, oftentimes it's the lead pastor has all the power and is sort of like penalizing everybody underneath them for the mistakes they might make and then not being held accountable for the mistakes they make, right? In a healthy culture, you would normalize that, hey, we're going to make mistakes, and we have ways of embodying that nobody's excluded from, where we extend grace to one another. In a congregation, there are times when people in our congregation mess up and make a mistake. As a leader, I want to be able to move towards them, not where they should be, but where they are, with grace. It also, by the way, goes the other way. I've had people come at me with clear expectations that I'm supposed to be perfect, and any slight mistake is like leveraged against me as if I'm like an enemy or something. And it's like, look, I'm a human being. So it also extends the way you interact with our church staff and leaders. None of us are perfect, and you're going to have to be grace-filled towards us as well.
Yeah, there's stuff hitting my brain right now. Even think about the idea, and this is not to say, I am not saying before I say this, that theology and like right theology within preaching isn't important. It is very much so.
Well, good.
But what were to happen if a culture of grace, when someone was preaching, said something that you're like, hey, I don't know if that aligns, rather than getting up in an uproar and being like, this is this and that, and you're calling out all of these things? What if it could be a conversation that you knew there was grace to say, hey, did you notice that this was said? I have a question, right? You can come at like things within like a preaching team and leadership as saying, hey, I don't know if I agree with this. Let's talk about it. Because the assumption isn't that you have to get it perfect, and if it's imperfect, if there's cracks in any of this, it's your fault, and I can't believe you did that, and this church is going down the tubes, and blah, 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 blah. You have all these connotations you add. What if it could be I will assume that because you're a human being, there will be times when you preach that there will be something you say that I'll be like, I don't know if I agree with that, or maybe there's a hole in that theory or something. Assuming that there would be a culture that says, hey, I have a concern, let's talk about it, not only gives grace to say I may not get it perfect all the time, but it also then adds to the strength of theology and doctrine and practice and things like that.
Yeah, I love what you're doing there, but what you're doing is taking sort of a magnifying glass and zooming in on just one area of church life. How do people relate to preaching and teaching?
Yeah.
And you could ultimately take that magnifying glass and zoom in on any area of church life and go, what would it look like for grace to be present? Yeah. Many people orient towards preaching as like the doctrine police, where they have to agree with everything or they're sort of in an uproar. And I've challenged some of these people over the years to go, I don't even agree with everything I say. Like, you know what I mean? I really don't. I mean, if I went back and listened to messages I'd preached 10 years ago, I'd probably say things slightly different today than I would have then, because I'm a person in progress. I can only preach based on where I am in my own followership of Jesus, and that's constantly, hopefully, moving up and to the right, So of course it's going to grow and develop.
Yeah, the church I grew up in, my dad is a pastor, and over time it became a very much the culture was, hey, we want people who are younger or wanting to like feel called into ministry or to preaching or teaching or some sort, to have the opportunity to do that. And that means that they are going to get up there and probably say something wrong. There were plenty of times when something was preached where someone would be like, did they just say that? I don't think that's right? And then they would bring it as a concern, and then it would be like if we're not defensive, we can be like, hey, we're all growing. Thanks for the concern. I agree with you, that probably needs to get corrected,
Yeah,
right? And then you
that's-
talk to them, and it's an opportunity for growth.
That's right. And so
Rather than boo and tomatoes on the stage,
that's
throwing stuff
right.
at 'em.
We're like, fear works against a culture of development.
Yes.
Bottom line,
That's a good way of putting it.
fear works against a development culture.
Yeah.
And in some churches, it'd be way too risky to put someone who's maybe a little more green on the pulpit for that very reason. But if you have a discipleship culture where it's like, no, we're all in the process of growing and being developed, and we intentionally develop others, we're not as scared about those moments because we know that those are actually what's needed for transformation and growth.
Yeah, like you've got to be willing to put people on the stage who forget to turn their mic off and sing in the earpiece of with the band the whole time.
Oh yeah,
That's
happened. I'm a horrible singer, and I once forgot to turn my mic off, so the whole room couldn't hear me, but the band could. I was in their in-ears, and I messed the entire band up because I was singing off key. So
Definitely happened to more than just you.
yeah, okay.
Yeah, I only bring it up because I forgot to turn my mic off last Sunday.
Oh, I
Did you?
see.
Yeah.
Did
Yeah,
you
yeah.
sing in their ears?
No, I didn't sing. I went in the back green room and started talking to somebody. And Adam quickly saved me by turning it off.
Nice.
Well, we have grace for you in those moments.
Yeah, Adam's
but
got my
just
back.
don't let it ever happen again.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's a good spot to transition. What does it look like for us to cultivate grace in our community? We're looking at Jesus and what he did and how that's inspiring to us and the work it did for him and his followers and other people. But what does it look like for us to develop that in our own communities? What are some specific things that we can do?
One idea is we can take our own sin more seriously than the sin of others. And let me explain what I mean by that. I think, okay, not me, but most people, I think, like to think that they have it all together.
But not you.
I'm kidding.
But not you.
I like to think I have it all together.
Did you see that look on her face? She's like,
But you guys looked at me like I was serious. I'm not serious. But okay, this isn't just in church, but I think it can be especially prevalent in churches. Like we like to talk about sins, but then focus on the ones that maybe we ourselves don't struggle with. And it can be really easy to sit up here and talk about like, oh, can you believe that group of people or this group of people? But not think about myself and where I might be falling short. But when we're gonna focus on the sins of other people, it's going to be harder to extend grace to them, right? So if I'm always focused on how other people around me aren't measuring up, I'm in a way blocking my ability to extend grace. But if instead my primary focus and energy is going on my own spiritual formation, my own walk with God, my own ability to cultivate my relationship and my walk with him and be open and receptive to his grace, I think that flows into an ability to extend grace towards other people. And one parable that sticks out to me that demonstrates this is in Luke 18. I just talked about this in the message I preached a couple weeks ago. In Luke 18, we see a parable of a tax collector and a Pharisee, or religious leader, and they both go to the temple to pray. It's a common story. And the Pharisee says, God, thank you that I'm not like other people. I tithe, I fast, like I do all the religious things. I'm such a good person. Thank you. And especially thank you that I'm not like that guy, the tax collector. And the tax collector simply says, have mercy on me, God, because I'm a sinner. And it says, of those two, the tax collector is the one who went home justified. And I think that shows that, again, like that the Pharisee, who was focused on his own righteousness and the sins of other people, blocked his ability to receive God's grace because he wasn't able to give it to other people.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think we have some work to do here. I think you're right that the more in tune we are with all the ways we're in desperate need of God's grace and mercy towards us, the more we actually experience that grace from Jesus, the more we don't have to hustle or squeeze it out, we naturally extend that to other people, right? And then I would say, and we have some work to do there because it seems to me the church, at least the broader reputation of the church in our culture is the exact opposite. Rather than being grace dispensers, we're sort of perceived as arrogant and hypocritical. And the reason why is because instead of reckoning with our own sin and taking that more seriously, we tend to fixate on the sins of other people and conveniently the ones we don't struggle with, you know?
Usually, yeah.
And they know that. And so our hypocrisy ends up kind of being exposed because they see right through it, and they see the sins in our own lives that we're not willing to wrestle with, and so on. So
it's sometimes that, and it's sometimes, for me at least, the fact that I don't allow myself to receive grace. Like, I tend to be hard on myself and feel like, okay, I did this well. Good job. Or, I really screwed this up. And because I can be hard on myself, and I, in a way, sometimes block my own ability to receive God's grace, then it becomes harder for me to extend it to other people. I hold them to the same standard that I'm holding myself to.
There's some projection there, right?
Yeah, maybe this connects back to our emotional intelligence series, that the more awareness we have of our own internal world, the easier it is to have grace for people who don't have it all together either.
Yeah.
Because I think it sounds to me, what you're naming is like, I can only be aware of what I'm aware of. I can only acknowledge the things I'm struggling with that I'm actually aware that I'm struggling with. And as we realize that God has nothing but grace for us, as we reflect on our own lives and our own internal and external struggles, and we are able to receive that grace, it just becomes a very natural byproduct, as what you're saying, to extend that to others.
That's right. And so the way we treat people is ultimately a reflection of how we experience God. If I'm really condemning and judgmental and sort of hard towards people, my guess is that is an extension of how I'm experiencing or perceiving God relating to me. Yeah. When I receive God's grace and mercy and his forgiveness freely flows into my life, that, if I'm transformed by that, if I'm genuinely experiencing that, that will leak out. It will spill out in my relationships with other people. So, yeah.
And I would say we really can't do it apart from receiving it first from God, because it goes against everything in our human nature. I think this cuts so hard against our defaults as human beings.
Well, I agree. I think we can take our own sin more seriously than others, and taking our own sin more seriously is going to start with bringing that into the grace-filled presence of God and receiving his grace, so that we can then learn how to extend it to other people through the empowerment of the Spirit. Another one I would name is that we can choose forgiveness and grace over bitterness and revenge. So, pardon my language here. I'm actually quoting one of my sisters. She's a therapist, but she'll often tell her clients that forgiveness is way more badass than bitterness. May have just lost a few listeners. But look,
Adam can bleep it out.
Yeah. When someone wrongs us, perhaps in a really deep way, it's so much more awesome to extend grace and forgiveness to them, rather than get stuck replaying how awful it was for them to do that thing to us, to demonize the other person and rehearse how awful they are, and daydream all day long about getting even. There's nothing sexy about bitterness. It does not look good on people, right? It looks awful. So what if we became a community where we learned how to respond to others who have hurt us and wounded us with forgiveness and grace, rather than that natural human default of bitterness and revenge?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it's a really beautiful thing. It is also a very difficult thing. It's not easy to choose forgiveness instead of bitterness. And I think it is very much an ongoing process. If you've ever gone through anything where there is something to be bitter about, I think you would be nodding your head if you're listening to this.
Well, totally. And that's why, again, part of my language, that's why it's more badass.
Yeah, it takes way more work.
You know, like if you think about something that you admire, like some feat that you admire, Memorial Day is coming up. Are you going to do Murph?
I think so.
All right.
I might do it as a partner. I don't know if I'm as in shape.
All right. So for our listeners, Adam, are you going to do Murph?
I'll be there.
All right. Awesome. Murph is like this workout that CrossFit's do on Memorial Day in honor of an American soldier who had the last name Murphy, and he was killed. But it's a mile run followed by 100 pull-ups, 200 push-ups, 300 air squats, and then you do another mile run. And the elite athletes wear vests, weighted vests, to make it a little bit more difficult. The point is, getting through that, man, that's tough. It's hard. I've done it several times. It is miserably hard. And that's what makes it cool.
Yeah.
Because you pushed and you were able to do something that was really hard.
Yeah.
There's a sense of accomplishment that comes with it. And so what I'm saying is, if maybe we approached forgiveness and grace a little bit like that, it's way harder than it sounds. But what if, similar to like the Murph, we kind of got some like juice from it? Like, man, yeah, it is hard, and that's what makes it meaningful. That's what makes it worth it.
Yeah, because the bitterness and unforgiveness flows very naturally. Like if you don't resist it when someone has, wounded you, if you don't resist it, it will just happen. So it takes an active work to say, nope, I'm not choosing that. I'm choosing something better.
I think that, and I think that speaks to everything about how Jesus lives and how he shows us to live. Like Jesus embodies an entirely different way of living and being in the world, right? That cuts against all of our human nature. And then he invites us to embody a different way of living and being in the world. And I think that's part of our witness. Like when we choose forgiveness over bitterness, when everyone around us goes, well, I'd be really bitter, I'd do this to get revenge or whatever, that is a way of sharing the good news.
It's countercultural.
Because it's countercultural.
Yeah, you're embodying the upside down kingdom, because that's not the way that the world works. Our world does not thrive on grace and forgiveness and mercy.
No, so it's part of our witness in the world.
Part of our witness. I didn't mean to exclude you. You can come do the Murph too if you want.
Oh, I'm good. I'll be on my Peloton.
Okay.
And then on the pontoon boat probably.
Okay.
But you guys can send me pictures.
Well, after Murph, I go to the Kilty and just load up on food.
I will meet you at the Kilty.
All right.
Sounds really good right now.
Yeah, it's kind of like a little joint in our community that's been around for a long time. Like the people serving, they come out on roller skates or whatever. But it's like burgers and shakes, and I can't wait.
My favorite thing at the Kilty is, we might have had this as a conversation starter last summer, but what do they call them? Blizzards, concrete, flurry, something like that, with chocolate, ice cream, and Oreo.
Sounds good.
That does sound good. Yeah, so one other way we can embody this is by cleaning up our messes with each other. I know we kind of talked about this. We already talked about this a little bit, but if we make mistakes, let's own the mistakes so we can make them right. We can't, often this grace, when we talk about like a pseudo grace, is maybe we extend ourselves some grace when we were the ones who made a mistake, and say, oh no, it's fine, I'm going to write it off and move on, without talking to the person being present to how they were impacted by what I did. And grace is it is meant to be a reciprocal thing, in the sense that if I'm extending grace to myself, and this other person I'm aware of could extend grace to me, then I can have boldness to go to them when I have hurt them. Because I can know that, hey, it doesn't change my status with God. We're cool, but I need to be present to how this impacted them, so that they can have a chance to extend grace back. And it's a whole process that ends up becoming a cycle. That's a very beautiful thing. We on our staff have a tool for cleaning up our messes, and a lot of language around it, so that if there is a mistake made, we know how to have a conversation about it and have talked about that extensively. And this just allows us to normalize failure rather than try to ostracize someone when you have made a mistake, and normalize cleaning it up.
Here's what I'm noticing about cleaning up our messes together is that starting with the small ones is like what's best, because they're not as emotionally charged and intense, So getting some reps with some easy, smaller messes is what provides like a foundation for dealing with some of the bigger ones. And we see that with Peter and Jesus in a way. Like that's a clean up the mess moment. And we kind of named, hey, because Peter experienced Jesus' grace before, he like jumps off the boat and leads to this massive mess that needs to be cleaned up between the two of them, right? My point is that one of the tensions I've noticed is that when there's even a small mess to clean up, it's like we often feel like, well, it's so small we could just kind of like wash over it, And those are the precise ones I think I would say pay attention to, because those are the easiest ones to kind of get some of those first reps to build that grace-filled culture or that grace-filled relationship.
Yeah.
In your marriage, if it's a small thing where you're like, I don't even have to say anything, and we could just let it slide. No, those are the exact ones where if you pressed into it, grace could become normative.
Yeah.
The new norm.
Yeah, even with kids. Like, if I think about actual messes in the house rather than maybe emotional messes.
Like when you find a sub in the back seat. What was it?
Gross. Seriously, a whole sub sandwich?
Yeah, it was like a
maybe
Jimmy
half.
John sub that from the day before that they had left there.
What kind?
I don't know.
Hopefully not the meatball one. That would have been really bad.
Yeah, that'd be terrible.
No, so there's one way to handle that. Freak out every time there is a mess, right? And then what does that do? Well, that creates fear around now. If I made a mess, I'm going to cover it up because I don't really want to see Dad's wrath, right? So I'm going to cover it up or stuff it in the couch cushion, which is something they do sometimes. And that is, it drives me nuts. But, or we can create if it's expected, like, hey, you're going to make a mess. I'm expecting that, but I am expecting you to clean it up. So it's not, it's a pseudo type of grace for me to say, make a mess and then walk away. Because grace without any sort of responsibility isn't necessarily love. It isn't going to equal love. So in this case, yes, if you make a mess, that's okay. I'm going to choose to stay calm, even though it's really, bothering me. But I am expecting you to clean it up and to do a decent job cleaning it up. Because that's what, hopefully that in turn will create I don't have to freak out when a mess is made. And if I don't know how to clean it up, I can come ask for help and all those things. So if we apply that to grace within relationships, I think it applies pretty well.
Yeah, well, hey, one of my favorite points in each of our podcast episodes is when we shift from talking about concepts to talking about practices.
Praxis.
Right? The praxis. The name of our podcast is Praxis, which is the
Praxis.
idea of the Praxis podcast. But I think it's really important to go, okay, how do we take this and then live it out in our everyday lives? So what would you guys say are some practices that our listeners could implement having listened to this conversation?
Yeah. I think one you can do totally on your own, you don't need any help for, is just to spend some time experiencing God's grace towards you. We can't give what we have not received. And often when we are lacking grace, we will, or when we're lacking in an area, we have this way of trying to force it out of ourselves to give more. But often we need to take a step back. And I think in this way too, if we are aware of just how gracious God is towards us, it makes it a lot easier to naturally extend grace towards others. And a way you can do that is, do we still have that tool on our website?
Which one?
Is it Practicing God's Grace?
Yeah, like orienting to God's grace.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So it's there's this little tool, and it's nothing more than a handful of Psalms. I think they're mostly Psalms, and they're just they're reflections about how God feels about us, essentially, and how He is towards us. And there is a list of them for when you wake up and when you go to sleep. And I remember doing this for a season, and I found it impactful. Maybe not necessarily in the moment, but over time, you start to memorize all of these.
Oh, yeah.
And you put it somewhere prominent so that when you wake up in the morning, it's the first thing you see. And you read them off, and hopefully over time, you actually memorize them. And it's the first thing you do when you wake up. The first thing on my mind is all these ways that God is gracious towards me. And then when you go to sleep, same thing. Before, put the phone away, before you turn the lamp off, I'm going to either read these or recite them either in my head or out loud. And then it's the last thing I remember as I go to sleep.
Yeah.
So that'd be a great way that you can do that is not adding a lot of time to your schedule, but I think is very impactful.
What a great practice maybe to share with kids too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do mine. I've got them printed off on the inside of my cupboard in my kitchen. And so while I'm making my cup of coffee and preparing to go downstairs and have a prayer time, I'm kind of going through those. And it's good for me to fix my attention on that because it's orienting to God's grace for the day. And it also is better than looking at my phone, which is a constant disruptor of our formation. Another practice, and we've been alluding to it, so I won't spend a ton of time here, is ask for forgiveness and give it to other people. So obviously, when you make a mistake, clean up your messes with others. And when others make a mistake, learn how to extend that grace and forgiveness without minimizing the impact that it had on you. So I'm noticing when other people make a mistake, I think we've been culturally conditioned to kind of minimize it or tell them it's no big deal. And one of the things I've been learning to do is to be honest with that person about the impact that it had on me. especially if it was like a negative impact. And the reason why is not to rub their face in it. It's actually because if you're not forgiving anything, then you're not forgiving anything.
It's kind of empty.
It's empty. The fact that there was a negative impact is what gives the forgiveness its power. It's what gives grace its power, right?
Yeah.
If you do something that like impacts me negatively and I pretend it didn't when it actually did and then say, I forgive you, that's way different than going, yeah, man, this is how it hurt me or this is how it disrupted my life or whatever. And dude, I love you and I forgive you.
Yeah.
That's so much more powerful.
I remember when Alex and I were dating, I don't know what I did, but I did something to bother him. And I remember him saying like, oh, it's fine. And I was like, no, it's not. I can tell it's not fine. Let's talk about it.
Yeah. And then, while we're on it, there's also moments though where maybe you made a mess and you go, hey, did that have an impact? And they go, no, it really didn't. And you have to be able to receive that too.
Yeah.
They're being honest. It didn't have a big impact as big as I made it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And a third one would be celebrate mistakes as an opportunity to grow. We alluded to this, but God isn't waiting for you to be perfect. And in fact, he's waiting to meet you in your mistakes because that's where grace lives. Grace doesn't live in the world of perfection and achievement as much as I would maybe like it to. But
Why?
God,
Because you're perfect? Is that what you're saying? Mm-hmm.
Yep. But God lives where the grace is. And that's, I think, whatever place we can't do it on our own. So mistakes are actually an opportunity to experience grace and to extend it.
Awesome. Well, bottom line here, if we just want to if we're wrapping this up, if we want a healthy church, we need to cultivate grace within the culture, one that embodies the way Jesus extended grace and offered restoration and growth in place of fear and perfection. And we can do this by taking our own sin more seriously than others, choosing forgiveness and grace over bitterness and revenge, and to take time to clean up our messes with each other when we make mistakes.
Thanks for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Next time, we're going to discuss another nutrient we can put into the soil to create healthy church cultures. We hope you'll continue to tune in.
Praxis is recorded and produced at Crosspoint Community Church. You can find out more about the show and our church at crosspointwi.com. If you have any questions, comments, or have any suggestions for future topics, feel free to send us an email. Also, if you enjoy the show, consider leaving a review. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.